Okay, so we will, I think it's maybe over here, is it recording? Is it recording? Okay, great. All right. So we'll shift gears a little bit here and move into what we were talking about last time. And I wanted to just show this again. Nathan came up and was talking about this graphic after class and pointed out that he was sort of confused by it and I really appreciated him doing that. And I hope that if any of you have suggestions on ways that I can make things clear or things that aren't understood with these graphics, because I want to, when I retire, I'll continue going forward and trying to put this all out onto the internet so that it can be widely available. But he suggested, you know, putting concepts in there. And then I started playing around with this to show the transition that takes place at age 13. But for today, we looked at the syncretic complexes and concepts. And when we were packing up last, Nathan asked, you know, what does syncretic mean? And I started to explain it, but we were so involved with the food production, and Froilan and Mohammed weren't here to remind me what I was talking about, and so we never finished it. But it's really actually very interesting. Did any of you look at the etymology of syncretic? Okay. Well, what they had in the etymological dictionary didn't really get into it. But one of the things, another thing with these pills I'm going to hand out is that it's going to cause you to, when you run into a word, even if it's a familiar word, especially if it's a familiar word, that you look at the etymological dictionary and go and trace it back to get the essence of the concept. Because a word like meaning, a word like identity, a word like value, a word like truth, a word like essence, we use them so much that we have some general idea about it, but we don't have an idea of how it's being used in a specific context. And that's where the work that Natalia has done for me with looking at it in the context of when Vygotsky was using it in the Russian has been so helpful. But the word syncretic, here's one of these things where we will go at it backwards because I didn't have. So each one of these things is a mode of thinking. It's a way of thinking. And thinking, here's another word. What does thinking mean? We'd probably come up with 20 different answers, sort of a little bit similar. But I guarantee you that for most people, thinking would not start with one-eyed Carrie. The concept of a one cell thinking. However, we've looked at that. It's taking information in and processing that energy that's coming in and acting on it. That processing is the foundation for thinking. So with each one of these, it's a different mode of thinking. There's a qualitative transformation that takes place between the different modes. You can see that they're overlapping. In that other graphic, I tried to capture that even adults sometimes use syncretic thinking. Well, what does syncretic mean? Got these pieces here. So, we'll speed through this. So all of this, we're looking at external energy that we've talked about, and then through interaction with nature, social interaction, languaging, that is what is taken in and becomes a mode of thinking. So syncretic, there's the island of Crete that was one of the oldest civilizations. They have remains of humans from 130,000 years ago from Crete, and there's the whole Mayan civilization was there. So there's all these were there different little tribes, groups of people, and they developed a huge amount of trade. And so they were throughout the whole Aegean Sea, they had contact with people, other peoples all around. And you can see here, and Greece was always trying to overrun Crete. And so these tribes on Crete were fighting one another. But then when the Greeks came, they all joined together, even though they had differences, they joined together to fight against the Greeks. So sin means with Crete. So all of these different groups came together to fight Greece. And that's what Vygotsky's talking about when he's talking about syncretic. Children pull together very different things based on their subjective affective experience of those things, and will group all of them under one word. So that Leroy is called mama, because that word is pulling different things together based on the affect. I have a nephew who had a 1.5-year-old, and the mom was concerned. She took a trip, and then the child was calling other women mama. He's forgotten who I am. He doesn't know who his is, and that. And I explained the syncretic, didn't use that word, but that's what they do. And they take that one word and apply it all over the place. That's what syncretic means. So if you think of something different being pulled together with Crete. So different but unified. Then one of the key pieces when we look at the conceptual neuronal network, and people have asked really what do you mean by that, or what's meant by it? We always have to take into consideration that that animals have conceptual neuronal networks. They have concepts: bad, food, danger, shape, size, motion, rest, distance. Something else is in there, but so they have those concepts. They're not abstract. They are not aware that they have those concepts, but that's a part of the evolution of mammals, brains. They're set up so that you've got a network in there. Information comes in, gets processed and acted on, And that is the conceptual neuronal network. This is a mouse brain. I think we've looked at this one before. There's a qualitative transformation between sense, which is signaling, and that's done with a lot of the gestures and color and whatnot. And then the meaning, where you're signifying, you're using a sign. And then there's in neurons, and we've talked about the trillions and trillions of connections. And so we've got our bonobo and our early human. They're getting information from patterns and energy. And so you're getting light waves, sound waves, the chemical, thermal, touch, sensations. And you look at the complexity of all of that. And then with the smell and the taste, and the nasal cavity is actually connected and is part of the tasting. And that's why it's very important when you have a nice Cabernet that you let the aromas just waft in. Look at the color, and you just gulp it down. And I've called this in the past, and I don't know if it's appeared in any of the videos that you all have seen, but it's a conceptual neuronal network survival guide. And that's what every animal has, is a guide for how to survive in their environment. And so that is a very important piece of the development. And we've seen this before, but this then, and the reason I'm going back here is that I was in yoga, the hot yoga last weekend, and I had this realization, and it's one of those things that you think, how, and I fell out of my yoga position, but how did I not think about this before? And what I didn't think about was, we talk about the syncretic, complexive, and conceptual. How did that develop with phylogenetically? And I don't think anybody has looked at that from Vygotsky's perspective. But it's a very interesting piece, and it's one that we can walk through together here. So we've got our early human, and then we talked about this internal visual field and the concept of a vector. A vector is a vehicle that's bringing the information in. So the focus is in on the vector, but it's not just a visual, it becomes also a sound with rock. And it picks out that particular, it's a vector because it's picking this one rock out, which could be a weapon. Now, at the beginning here, the early human, the visual perception is predominant. So that their activity, how they act in nature, is totally tied in with what they're getting, what information they're getting in through the light waves. And that's the way early humans were. But then you can see how the transition starts to change here, so that instead of just having the visual picture of the rock, you have the concept of the rock. And that concept, it's at the very beginning, a concept of the rock. And this process would take place, and you think of all the other other words that then get added on. And this is a key point too. It's one that we'll run into when Vygotsky talks about written language. And in the readings, I've skipped chunks that we'll go back to later that deal with foreign language acquisition and written language. But he makes the point that with reading, once the child has a recognition, an understanding that these little squiggly lines at the bottom of the page where there's a beautiful picture, that these squiggly lines hold meaning. Think about that. Before, it's squiggly lines. The meaning is in that picture. But once they have the realization that these squiggly lines have meaning, then it's just a question of building on that. And in a similar way with early humans, once they came to understand that the words can be applied to things in nature, to objects, then they don't have to go through that whole process for every single object. They then start putting together and words build. Well, this is really changing at the very beginning, it's syncretic in that a rock can be used to mean all rocks, and it can be used for, rocks are used for cooking and tools for cooking, and then rocks and other instruments. And so we've covered this before. And one of the things that was very important and that I didn't go into with baby Leroy, which was that if I went in there and was taking a drink, I said, I have my bottle. Here's my bottle. And little Leroy points over at him. And I said, yeah, and that's your bottle. And then he goes, yes, that's right. And I know Leroy at that point was thinking, yeah, it's kind of nice to see, Dad all sort of goofy and smiling and happy. But it sure is easy to get him to act all goofy. All I got to do is mumble a couple of sounds and he gets all excited like that. And that's how language starts, where there's joint. And this is where the eyes are so important. And I was going to mention before, with chimps, if you look over, the chimps will look. They'll follow your look. But if you just, they won't move. Whereas with humans, if you move your eyes and just look without moving your head, the eyes are so much more important. And you think about it when, you come face to face with a foe, you stare them down. It's trying to deceive them to get them to back down because you don't want to fight because you could die. And so that staring down is huge. And you can see you can read emotion through the eyes. And you think about the, boxers or UFC fighters wearing in, or when they come into the middle of the ring, they stand there and stare one another down, that it goes way back to so. But this mutual understanding, this joint attention that a baby has with an adult on an object tied to a sound, that's the foundation of languaging. And its affect is huge in that. And so this really is looking at this, the transformation from verbally dominated perception to visually. And so the change in the nature of affect in this transformation. And I think this is an extremely important point, that for all mammals, affect is huge, and it is for us too, but that affect is key to survival. From the little bacteria cell, does this feel good or feel bad? Right from there on, affect is huge. But with this, with verbal perception, that affective side is still important, but it can diminish because you're not tied to an affective response. You can think about it, you can process it. And that's a very important piece in this transformation. And this syncretic thinking that they're going through is key to that. So one of the things that we haven't looked at, you can see how we can blame this on coronavirus, that I didn't have this all. So I think Nathan a few weeks ago said it's not just with objects, but it's also actions, but it's also relationships. And we haven't really talked about this very much, but I think it's huge for the development thinking. And that is that a lot of the language wasn't just for the objects or action, it's for social relationships, the relationships that exist within the clan. And so what Leroy was talking about with the mama, and in the person, the most revered are elderly women, the elders, and that's where wisdom lay. They controlled, women controlled social organization for all ancient societies that they've run into. And I've talked about Morgan, who got collected all of this information. I don't know if I mentioned, he's the only English speaking author who was cited by Freud, Marx, and Darwin. And so he looked at 170 languages. And in all of those languages, the relationships, the language was all matrilineal. So this looking at and having names for these different relationships is huge. You were going to say?
I was thinking about Iroquois with the longhouse and the elder woman.
Right.
You know, running a longhouse.
Yeah, and males always get put up as the warriors and the chief and all of that, but they had a council of elderly women that they, at their behest, these people ruled. That's just the person. That just means the individual. So here would be the elderly woman in this particular clan. There's several clans, and so this relationship between the mother and the child. So ego is, we're looking at it all based on on you. And so then it's looking at you're the foundation here. And then the main male in this system is not the father, because the father goes over and is part of could be part of another tribe, but it's the uncle, and that's the dominant male in a matrilineal society for the child. And then you look, the male here, your brother, goes over to, becomes part of another one. And you think about the complexity of language in order to describe these relationships, because here the ego, and you can see the father and the mother, the father, the offspring, and it's a male, offspring can become part of a different clan, or it can be a sort of a subgroup within that. But having the language to talk about this, think of the names and the process with the, let's say that has a name, and that's mother-child relation. So the baby then, when they start languaging, then starts thinking that other little babies have the same name. But then it's a process of the same with we do with your children, that you don't overtly correct them, but through time they come to understand that it's not my mother, but it's a cousin, or it's some other kind of relationship. And it's extremely complex. And I think that this kind of thinking and languaging was huge for early humans, laying the foundation for conceptual thinking. And so when we think of complexes and thinking in complexes, for phylogenetically, this, I think, was a huge piece of that. And I see it's about time, so I think this is a good place to stop recording. One thing with this, just that we've talked about the specific and the general, and this was a big piece of what Vygotsky talked about. A child will get the higher level of generality by saying flower to mean all flowers. And even if they take a specific flower like rose, then every flower is generalized to be a rose. And so a lot of people were saying that with concepts, you build up from these very bottom ones, the specific to the general. And Vygotsky says, no, that there's a constant interplay between this. And if we saw that with the matrilineal, the general would be the ancient elder, or the elder woman. And that would be the general. The specific would be the mother to the child. And so those relationships are examples, I think, of the specific and the general. And it's moving between these that you then develop understanding of the concepts. So why don't we leave it here, and so we can stop recording. And if you want to spend a few minutes talking with your interest group and figuring